I thought I'd start by reading Micah 6:8. It's up here. And he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is a verse that I know several of you have tattooed on your arm. It's a verse that I think this church holds dear as part of who we want to be. And I think that's awesome, because this is a really succinct way that God is telling us what he wants. And you can see these same values throughout the entire Bible. Justice, actually, the word justice appears over 400 times in just the Old Testament alone. New Testament often uses words more like righteousness or things that are complementary to the description of justice, just a language shift. But justice is present, and it's one of the things that's talked about through the entire story of the Bible from beginning to end. So just thinking about that, what is the big deal with justice? We live in a country that has a okay justice system. I think one of the better ones in the world when you look at the entire world. And I think it's something that we can be proud of. It definitely needs help. I don't think that our justice system treats every single person fairly. But we have a justice system that functions. So is that good enough? Did we design our culture in a Christian manner, and now we can just sit back and pat ourselves on the back and say, good, we did it? No. It would be really nice if it was that simple, but in the Bible, doing justice isn't just a one-time thing. It's not setting up a functional court system, sitting back and just letting it operate. That's a big piece of it, I think. But it's a lifestyle. It's a selfless way of life that we need to live and embody in everything we do all day, every day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But I thought I'd start by showing one of my favorite Bible Project videos that always explains everything better than I ever can. So will you roll the first clip?
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate.
And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care.
If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other.
But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust.
Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice?
Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God.
Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil.
And this identity, it's the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are.
And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works.
And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
Yeah, doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
with the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible.
So the first thing I want to talk about is just limitations of English. We interpret most everything through English. I think one of the unfortunate things about living in the United States is that we're not exposed to tons of different language. Studying language, jumping into other cultures, it's a great way to kind of rethink everything you know and phrase it differently. One of the challenges of the English language is our word justice really fits mainly a concept of retributive justice. So 2 types of justice out there that are really commonly spoken of: retributive justice and restorative justice. There's probably a ton of other things too that you can lump into this category, but I think that these 2 help us really understand what the Bible means by justice. So the Bible means both. Both of these are important. Retributive justice is usually what we're talking about when we say justice. It's something like, you stole something from this guy and you've got to pay the price. And that should be fairly in line with the magnitude of your crime. A lot of it has to do with punishment and trying to right wrongs through a system of just thinking about the consequences of your actions. Really, it's largely focused on the oppressor and a little bit less on the victim, although I do think that we consider that as well. It's a really good thing. The Bible has a lot to say about this type of justice. There's a lot in there, especially if you read the Old Testament law. There's a lot of things, sometimes that we'd think are crazy, ways that people set up punishments to fulfill the depth of a crime so that you pay for what you did. Very good thing. It's very important. It's definitely biblical, but it's only a teeny tiny portion of what's referred to in the Bible when we talk about justice. The much bigger concept that is referred to in the Bible under the word justice is the concept of restorative justice. So this is a little bit harder to wrap your mind around. I think sometimes it can cause us to feel angry a little bit because there's a slightly different version of fairness in the concept of restorative justice. Restorative justice focuses on the rehabilitation of the offender and not just paying for the crime. It also focuses on reconciliation with the community, reconciliation with the victim. I think the big key thing is bringing people together and thinking about the whole community and all of the people who were impacted by this one action of unfairness. We do a bit of this. You'll hear, I think that there's a lot of schools in the United States that have been trying to figure out this challenge. How do we come up with a more restorative justice model? But one of the best examples that I could think of was a friend of mine who is running an organization called CSJ. It's Council to Secure Justice. They are a bunch of lawyers who live in New Delhi, India. They came out of an organization that I used to work for called IJM that did a lot of anti-human trafficking and just fighting for justice and fighting to try to figure out how to jumpstart legal systems. And what I really love about these guys is that they've tackled a challenge, a huge challenge, which is that 53% of children in India, especially in New Delhi right now, have suffered some form of sexual abuse. It's this crazy thing that's happening. I think the numbers have gone up because when I was in India, that was, I guess about 12 years ago, it was more like 36%. So something's happening right now that isn't healthy. And there's a lot of attention being focused on this. So my friends jumped into this challenge and thought, okay, well, maybe what we need to do is we need to jump into one of the places where it's the harshest and try to find victims and then try to get those victims, their cases heard, and try to get the bad guys put in jail. And that'll be justice. But what they found as they dove into this problem, which is one of the things that I saw when I was working there as well, is that oftentimes the oppressors, the people who are committing these heinous crimes against children, there were lots of reasons to be sympathetic towards them. In a lot of ways, they were abused themselves. It's a cyclical problem. A lot of times it was out of desperation. I think a bigger challenge is that often this happens within a family. And so when you put the bad guy in jail, sometimes the bad girl, but usually the bad guy in jail, you take away the main breadwinner. And so it's almost like the family gets hit twice. The first time because of the crime, and the second time because of the economic challenges and the stigma that goes with having a parent or an aunt or uncle or somebody put in jail over something as terrible as that. So in order to solve this challenge, you can't put 50% of people in jail in proportion with the extent of the crime. You got to think creatively. And so they don't have the answer yet. They're still trying to figure it out. But they've been working a lot with social workers and a whole bunch of different community groups to try to figure out, okay, how can we set up a system that thinks about the parent, thinks about the needs of the child, thinks about the magnitude of what happened to that child and provides care for that child who's been hurt and abused, but also addresses the fact that they're reliant on the person who committed the crime. I think it's really beautiful. I think that is really hard. And if you ever want to check out some really cool people, go to their website. I think it's csj.org. Might be csjindia.org. Really amazing people who are following just kind of a heart for people who are victimized and marginalized in society and addressing a problem that is not cool to talk about, and they were doing it well before anybody else was talking about it. So great organization, read about them. There's a lot of people following this concept in the United States, but I thought that their example explained the challenge really well. So let me go back to the Bible Project and show us kind of a bigger picture of what this looks like in our daily life, not just a challenge in some country far away, but what this could look like daily.
But they weren't the only ones. There's injustice everywhere.
Yeah, some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves.
So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones.
And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet he died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them.
The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways.
Yeah, if God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others.
This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems.
This is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you, humans, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
So thinking about that, I think one of the biggest takeaways is just a contribution that Christianity, the Judeo-Christian way of thinking, has brought to the world, which is this concept that all of us are equal under God. And I think that that's at the root of how we need to think about justice. We're equal, but we're not necessarily great. We've done a lot of things to kind of harm our relationship with God and harm our relationship with others and the community and the environment around us. But in that, grace is equally poured onto all of us. And so what the Bible talks about very frequently when you look up the word justice is you often see references to verses that talk about identifying who in your society is vulnerable, and then trying to figure out how can you lift them up. So a lot of justice is really this concept of structural injustice, and trying to reconcile that and restore it. So thinking about who around us is being left out? Maybe where have I had privilege? That's a word that we've been using a lot in this country, and I think that that's wonderful. Where have I had a hand up and maybe someone else hasn't? And not being ashamed of your hand up, but trying to figure out how I can fix this so that we all have an opportunity to thrive. So in the Old Testament, the culture was more of like a tribal farming families type of culture. It's what we see a lot in Central Africa, places around the world where the economy hasn't developed as much as in other places where everybody farms. That was the society that we lived in. So thinking about who was marginalized in the Old Testament, it was often women. Women didn't always have the ability to own land, and so maybe they became a widow. Something happened to their husband, and they're vulnerable. They might get their land taken away, and then how do you care for yourself? It could be children, but especially orphans. People who don't have a family structure that has access to land, because that's the only way of making a living in a farming society. It could be immigrants, foreigners, people who have come to your area for some reason or another. They might not have access to land, and so they could have no way to care for themselves. The more interesting one, I think, is that Israel was split into 12 tribes, and one of the tribes was designated as church workers, essentially people who cared for the synagogue and who cared for the religious teachings in the society, and they didn't have any land. So they had no way to make a living, and so it was part of the whole tithe system of giving 10% of your income was recognizing that it's not all mine, that one of these tribes of Israel is designated to not work for a living, but to care for my spiritual health. So 1/10 of anything I grow is theirs. And that's where a lot of that came out of. And we still do that. I mean, we still have Brandon who's here full time. And so there are a lot of people who are left out of the economic system, and those are the ones that we see the Bible talking about as care for these people. So a great example is Psalm 146, verse 9, which is, the Lord watches over, in this one it says the alien, but the foreigner, and sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the way of the wicked. That's just one example of many, many, many verses, at least 400 verses, that identify a vulnerable population and then talk about how we need to care for them. In the New Testament, this gets even more exciting because it kind of like steps it up a notch. Similar concept, we're looking for who's left out, who's vulnerable, who needs a hand up and hasn't had the same access to opportunity that the rest of us have. You see a few more people coming on. Suddenly slaves are a thing. Slaves might have been there in the Old Testament as well, but they're mentioned a lot more often in the New Testament. An example is Colossians 4:1. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair because you also have a master in heaven. I read those verses sometimes and think, huh? Is the Bible endorsing slavery? But what I think it's really saying is slaves are in our culture right now. Around the time of Jesus, that was a pretty big thing. And they're marginalized. They're victimized. So how do we care for them and make sure that their needs are being addressed and that they're treated with equality and fairness? Also, at the same time, when you look at Jesus, you see a lot of care for the handicapped, people who are suffering from a bunch of different illnesses that have left them out of society. My favorite is the lady who comes up to Jesus because she's had her period for 3 months or like for her whole life or something like that, and she's been stuck somewhere apart from the rest of the culture. And just as a lady, I think that sounds terrible. But it could be blind people, it could be lame people. Jesus had a huge heart for people who are marginalized. And that's really exciting, is to stop and think about who is this God that we serve. So in the form of Jesus, he's still God. He still has complete power and authority. He could do anything. And yet Jesus came and he humbled himself and he focused so much of his ministry on caring for the marginalized. And then ultimately, he paid the price for all of us, seeing us all as sinful. So there's something huge and deep in there, but I think the thing that we don't often dwell on is how a lot of Jesus' ministry was really a justice ministry, caring for the ones who are left out and overlooked by society. So just thinking about our culture, I spend a lot of time thinking about this because I work for a nonprofit that does a lot of justice work, and that's where I've spent most of my career. Who's marginalized in our culture today? So going back to the structural issues thing, the one that I'm working on right now, which is huge and nobody knows about it, and that is kind of exciting and kind of sad, is 85% of people living below the global poverty line right now are rural farming families, look like the people in the Old Testament. And those people are overlooked and left out by our economic systems and the way that we think. It seems crazy to me that the people growing our food are starving sometimes. That just feels wrong, unjust. The other huge thing coming is that this 85% of people in poverty are getting hit already with the impact of climate change. As land-based, their whole economy is based on the land, and their lifestyle is based on the land. When floods come, droughts come, the rain comes at the wrong time, or maybe there's too much rain, there's no rain, these things can be a life and death situation. They can definitely be a huge challenge to caring for your family. And I don't think when we think about climate change that we think about the faces of 85% of the world's poor, but we should. So Plant with Purpose is where I work. Check it out. I'm not here to tell you about my other job, but Plant with Purpose is a really cool organization based in San Diego that's trying to address this inequity of the impact of environmental degradation on the vast majority of the world's poor. Really interesting. But going closer to home, in the United States, I think that there's a lot of people that I started making a list, and then I just had to stop making the list because that would be the whole sermon. But think about who hasn't had the same equal opportunity as everybody else. First thing that came to my mind was race issues. That's so big right now, and I think has always been big, and I'm really glad that we're thinking and talking about it right now. There is a lot of structural injustice in our society based on race, and it should not be. Mentally ill is another huge category of people. I was just thinking about how many of those mass murders that we've seen have been committed by people with some mental illness, and I just think that that's a huge indicator that our society is failing that entire community. Children from non-stable families, you can take that in any number of directions, but if you didn't have advantages growing up because something was going on, you're likely to always be several steps ahead throughout the rest of your life. Addicts is another one, and their families and the communities where they live. I think addiction again is one of those huge things that's growing, and it impacts not just the addict, but all the people around them, and that's another way that we're going to see a huge crowd of people suffering injustice rising up. Elderly, I think, was another huge one that came to my mind. It's so easy to get taken advantage of, and I think that's a crowd that we need to pay more attention to. So thinking about taking that even closer to home, one of the things that I just am so excited about in this church is the way that we've embraced street angels, looking for one population that shows up on our doorstep in San Diego all the time. Street Angels focuses on youth, so people between the ages of 18 who have left the foster system to 26, I think, is the limit. So 25? I was close. Thanks. But people who are still young, trying to get ahead, and are homeless often, or at severe risk of homelessness, and addressing that through a whole bunch of different ways, whether it be the shelters here on Tuesday night, I think there's a Friday night one at another church, or through the more permanent housing program that they've got up and running. I think this is awesome because this is definitely a community that we see a lot of in San Diego, and a community that we can jump in and help and really quickly set them on a path towards being able to thrive in our culture. And I'm really proud of all the work that everybody in this church does to keep that going and successful. And I think part of the justice ministry that John was talking about is continuing to have that focus on street angels, but also thinking a little bit bigger and broader. Where else can we be talking about these issues? So I think that that's a great thing. And definitely get involved. Jump in and dive into street angels or any of the other justice ministries that we're working on. I think the last major point that I wanted to share with you is just understanding who Jesus is and understanding human nature. I think one of the biggest cautions that we need to consider when talking about justice ministry and trying to live a life of justice is that justice cannot happen at the expense of others. So often, the oppressed, when they have gained power, have become oppressors themselves. That, I kind of feel like, is maybe the title of most history books that we can read, and unfortunately, it's deep within human nature. And I think at a societal level, we do that, but I think sometimes even at a personal level, we do that. I was reading an article in Philanthropy magazine that was talking about giving patterns, and one of the things that they found is that people who have the most money, or people who live in wealthy neighborhoods, oddly, are often the least generous. The people who give the most are the people who are living in neighborhoods where there's a lot more need. So it's when your neighbors clearly have a need that you start to understand, wow, I've been blessed in some ways, and that pours into generosity. A lot of studies that look at that, but it's deeply ingrained in human nature. When you've been given privilege or an advantage, you often see it as just something everybody should have, and you start to look down on people who maybe haven't been given the advantage that you've been given. And that's wrong. So there's a theologian, Bible scholar named Bruce Waltke, I think is how you say his name. He has a quote that I think summarizes this really well. The righteous are those who are willing to disadvantage themselves to the advantage of their community. The wicked are those who are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. So just thinking about that again, the way that we should be, the godly way, the way that as Christians we're designed to try to live and to do everything we can, is to be thinking in a way of advantaging the community around us and not always thinking of me. It's very selfless. And when you become wicked is when you step to the other side and you flip that upside down and you start to think about, I need to take care of me, and those people just got to do their own thing. And you begin to enter into the temptation to take what you need at the expense of others around you. But that's not God's way. Again, just kind of briefly, going back to the Old Testament, you look at the story of humanity and our relationship with God over and over and over again. We let him down, we offended him. And God chose, he made a commitment to people to not destroy us, but it was his right. And yet he chose not to do that. He chose instead to continue to seek us out and to forgive us over and over and over again. So just understanding this is the God that we serve, the God that we should strive to be more like, we need to do that in our lives. Again, Jesus, full power and authority, and yet he spent all of that power and authority caring for the marginalized, people who were left out, and all of humanity that did not deserve his grace, and yet it was poured so freely on us. This is the God that we serve. It's a God of justice. So do justice, but never do it in a way that disadvantages the community for the betterment of yourself or your people group. Be thinking about that all the time, because I think we all do it, probably on a daily basis. And it's something that we need to be convicted of. So just thinking about this again, there was a documentary that Drew and I watched recently that I thought was just a really beautiful example of a guy kind of radically, so radically that a lot of people are really mad at him, trying to live out a vision of justice that seeks reconciliation. So his name is Daryl Davis. The documentary, I think, is on Netflix, so you could look it up, but play a little bit of that here.
I'm Daryl Davis. I'm a musician, actor, author, and a lecturer. People always say to me, Daryl, how can you have this stuff? Well, why don't you burn it? As shameful as it is, you don't burn our history, regardless of the good, the bad, the ugly. How can you hate me when you don't even know me? Look at me and tell me to my face why you would lynch me.
This country's been through a lot.
It still has a long ways to go.
An awful long way, as news will tell you.
I'm mad. We should all be mad.
We have a society that has determined that we should fear the black man.
Give that person a platform. Allow them to air their views, and people will reciprocate. I never set out to convert anybody. In my quest, some of them ended up converting themselves.
The documentary is called Accidental Courtesy. It just kind of goes along the life of this guy, Daryl Davis, who has a really interesting life. He's a pretty unusual guy. He's a musician, but on the side, just out of curiosity, he started to get to know KKK people because I think the whole concept of racism just baffled him a little bit, and he thought, well, I'll just go talk to them because he's that type of person. And along the way, he's gotten to make a lot of friends who are in the white power movement, and a lot of them have, through their relationship with him and his just care for them as humans, have come to realize their folly and step down. It's a really cool story. I think just an unusual story, but there's this one scene in the movie that I thought was fascinating. He gets invited to go to a Black Lives Matter protest, and he meets a lot of people involved in that protest, and they have this really heated argument, basically about you're wasting your time, is what they kept telling him. Like, why are you doing this? You're doing the wrong thing. You should be thinking about how to advance our people. You shouldn't be thinking about how to reconcile with those people because they're bad and they're not us. And I get that. I think that's exactly how I would feel. You understand the depth of the anger that comes towards Daryl in this scene. It's human and it's real and it's raw and there's so much truth in it. But what I thought was really cool is Daryl reached out to these guys with the same attitude that he reached out to the KKK members and said, wow, okay, there's hatred coming my way and maybe I need to understand it. Maybe I need to humble myself and to try to figure out what it is. It doesn't mean I gotta agree with you. It doesn't mean I gotta agree with the KKK members, but how do I be a person who reflects reconciliation in my society? So I'll show you the next clip where he gets to know this guy whose name is Kwame Rose.
That day in Baltimore, we're there to shoot Michael Wood, the former police officer turned activist, and he asked if we wanted to speak to some Black Lives Matter activists that he worked with, and we did, and it sort of came together on the spot. And obviously I do wish that Daryl and Kwame had a chance to get to know each other first, but in a sense I wouldn't change anything because the conversation we've had today and for the past 7 or 8 months since this film premiered on this subject is a conversation I think a lot of our audiences have never had before. And it's a generational split in the Black community that a lot of our white audiences had no awareness of whatsoever. So if this brings a topic to the forefront that needs to be, I'm glad it happened this way, and I'm just glad that these two gentlemen are big enough to, still work with us and talk about it, and it means a lot to me.
Yeah, so that's just a tiny little brief clip. It's a whole long documentary, hard to pull just little bits of it, but through conversation, he figured out how to get to know this younger guy who is filled with anger in the same way that he was reaching out to the KKK members. And what I loved about the follow-up to the documentary is that they kind of start to like each other. You can even see it in that little clip. Like, they can put their arms around each other briefly, and you can see that there's an actual, real relationship. And so this is just one guy navigating really complicated waters, I think, and just living in the gray area. And you probably know that you're right when you're getting attacked on both sides a little bit, and that's just not really comfortable. But I think he's a great example of a way that we can seek to live our lives. How do we live our lives being people of reconciliation who are fighting for justice at the same time? I think that's God's picture of what justice, doing justice, can look like in our society. So I just want to leave you today kind of dwelling on the thought of justice as a radical, selfless lifestyle. The sermon probably could have been turned into a whole series of sermons or like a giant book. There's so much depth in there, and if you want to read more, dive into the Bible. Look at the Gospels, especially the middle section of almost every Gospel where Jesus is doing his ministry in the community. But go out into the world. Do justice. Be justice in our community. Imagine what our culture would look like if we all lived this crazy version of justice every day. Think about how that would impact the way that the United States relates to the rest of the world. Just things I never get to say so publicly in my job is think about what that would mean if we're thinking about climate change and our impact on the choices we make every day and how that hits that 85% of the population. Think about how this would address U.S. culture and politics, how maybe we should be talking to each other instead of yelling at each other, but we also need to be addressing the fact that there are people in our culture who are left out. And that should be really a primary focus of the way that we think as Christians. Think about how that would impact this church. I think that we do a pretty good job, but we can always do a better job of just being that reflection of God in the world by living and acting justly every single day. How would that impact your family? That's a harder one. Are there people in your family who are isolated, who are left out, marginalized? It's a really common story in families. And what does it mean to be a Christian who lives a life of justice in your family? Think about this at work. I think that's probably one of the harshest places where we see justice. I don't think there's a lot of jobs that really emulating a justice-oriented lifestyle is what your boss would say do all the time, but how do we do that while still being good employees and still living within this culture? So how do we live a life that's set apart, a life that lives a crazy view of justice, that looks like how God wants us to live, and yet do that in the midst of our culture? I think that's the struggle that we need to be focused on all the time. One last thing to think about is that we all do this differently. We all have different gifts and skill sets. There are people who are phenomenal at going to marches and standing up and being seen and being part of it and just thrive on that energy. There are people who really kind of don't like a crowd, and maybe their way of doing justice is to find one or two people and to help them up. All of that is right. All of that is godly. All of that is doing and being justice. So don't judge. Don't judge your neighbor for living justice differently than you live justice, but just celebrate the generosity and the diversity that we've been given in this world, that all of us, in all of our many, many ways, are a reflection of our Creator and are equally loved. So just thinking about that, I want to pray and then lead into communion. So God, teach us to be people who are willing to take a risk. Teach us to be people who are willing to be so different than the culture that we're surrounded in. Teach us to be people who put others before ourselves, who put you before everybody else. And to be able to dwell on the fact that we're all fallen, that we're all sinful, that none of us are perfect, and that we hurt people sometimes. And we just want to come before you with humility and the thought of apology, that we've done wrong and you've given us grace. And so please teach us to share that same forgiveness and that same reconciliation with the community around us. And God, thank you so much for the way that you have continued to reach out and to pull us in and to give us a view of what goodness looks like beyond our imagination. And let us just dwell on the awesomeness of who you are today. Amen.